Did Japan make a fatal mistake during their attack on Pearl Harbor by not sending out a third wave and by not destroying the American oil tanks? That is how the story is often portrayed, and famously so in Tora, Tora, Tora. 第二次攻撃の発艦準備はどうした?それは第二波が戻ってくる前に発艦せんと収拾がつかず。しかし隊長、第二次攻撃の準備命令が出ません。Turns out the real story is very different, and to help explore that, Justin and I sit down with Jonathan Parshall to discover more. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us. Just as a brief introduction for those people who don't know Jonathan Parshall. First of all, you should know Jonathan Parshall, but John has an extremely passionate interest in the Pacific theater of operations during World War II, especially the Imperial Japanese Navy. In fact, his first model kit was the Haruo cruiser in 5th grade, and that's just how it starts. But he's also adjunct lecturer at the U.S. Naval War College, and you've also written this book that should be in everybody's bookshelves. Right there, Shattered Sword, the untold story of the Battle of Midway, together with Anthony Tully, of course. And John also has 2 websites now, combinedfleet.com, which is an excellent resource on the PTO and the IGN. And as well as that, you should definitely check out 1942book.com. That's where Jonathan has a mailing list sign up for his new book that is coming out in 2026. Jonathan, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we wanted to draw on your expertise here on the attack of Pearl Harbor, specifically speaking about that third wave, because Justin and I, we still constantly run into this myth that the Japanese maybe planned, debated about a third wave, and that never happened, and that was some sort of critical oversight, some critical mistake that they did that comes to haunt them in as the war progresses. So to lay the land here for everyone, let's talk a bit about the geography of Pearl Harbor on Oahu. This is one of your slides. Can you just briefly tell us what we're seeing here?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're looking over the anchorage. Obviously, there's Ford Island right in the middle there, the Battleship Row, where all the high priority targets for the first wave of torpedo bombers were. And then the stuff that's highlighted in blue can be roughly categorized as repair areas, logistical areas. You got the repair basin, you've got the dry docks there. The sort of oblong one that's in the middle is actually where a lot of the warehouses for the submarine base are located. So these are all places that if you were serious about trying to do away with Pearl's ability to repair ships and whatnot, that you would want to go after. And then the next slide in red shows both of the big fuel tank farms that are located at the naval anchorage. And this, of course, has been, one of the most pernicious myths that's carried on. I don't know that it will ever die, to be honest with you, that the Japanese should have gone after these areas in Pearl Harbor with a third attack wave, and that had they done so, that they might have extended the war or forced the Pacific Fleet to rebase back to San Francisco or something like that. And yeah, like I say, it's pernicious. I don't think it'll ever die, and it's also completely untrue.
Yeah, we'll get into that as we go along here. As a basic geography point here again, that's Pearl Harbor here is on Oahu. That's to the south, next to where you see Hickam Field, of course. But that is not just the only target during the attack on Pearl Harbor. We also have Wheeler Field, Kaneohe Field, and Iwa Field that were targets. So just to let everybody know that as these first waves are coming in, so the first waves is roughly 180 aircraft. The second wave is roughly 170 aircraft. They are not just hitting the harbor in itself, but they're also hitting other installations.
Right. Yeah, it's important to realize that if you look at the actual sortie count that the Japanese are dedicating in both of these waves, they're actually devoting more aircraft to air supremacy roles than they are to attacking the anchorage proper. Which gives you a sense for how nervous they were about making sure that the organic air power that's on Oahu is suppressed so that, those forces can't reach out and touch their carrier task force in retaliation. And so as a result, they're going to smear all of the airfields on this island in the course of this attack. And this to me is one of the other sort of myths that you hear a lot is that, oh, the British raid on Taranto, put the seed into the Japanese minds that, they could do an operation like this. And first of all, the Japanese were already working on this operational concept even before Taranto went down. And second, if you just look at the sophistication of this operation vis-a-vis Taranto, Taranto is one carrier coming in at night, launching a group of torpedo planes at night to do a hit and run attack and, get the heck out of Dodge before the sun rises, because they know that they cannot survive in the threat environment that the Germans and Italians have created in the Mediterranean by that point in time. As opposed to this operation where, the Japanese are bringing 6 aircraft carriers, around 400 aircraft in total. They are the threat environment, right? So we're coming in here, and not only are we going to go after the naval anchorage, we're going to shut down every airfield on this island simultaneously and make sure that the Americans cannot retaliate against us. And so that's, to me, it's sort of like comparing a Model T to, a late model Packard, if you will. This is a much more sophisticated operation. And frankly, no other Navy in the world at this time could have done this operation, because there's just so many things that have to be coordinated simultaneously. And you've got to have a huge collection of flight decks with a hell of a lot of aircraft to actually make this happen.
Yeah, and to get sort of a sense of how this looks like, at least in a portion of it, right? So we have here the first air fleet and the carrier Akagi, and I've already put a red box around one particular individual here, who's Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, who we're going to talk about a lot in this video, I believe. But that sort of gives you a sense as the viewer of what it looks like, the strike package. Of course, beyond Akagi, you also have Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Suikaku. But that's what we're looking at. And I think the first attack is also the one that brings the Kates, and the second one doesn't have any Kates whatsoever.
That's right. That's absolutely right. There are going to be level bombing Kates in the second wave that are going to be launched by Shokaku and Zuikaku that are going to go after places like Kaneohe. But when we think of the classic, the naval attack or the attack against the naval anchorage, all of the Kates that are slated to do either torpedo bombing or high-level bombing against the inboard battleships on Battleship Row, that all happens within the first 5-6 minutes of the attack.
Talking about Fuchida, then I think we'll go straight into this myth of the third wave. Yeah. And now comes a picture that I think a lot of people will recognize, because it is based on a really cool movie, Tora, Tora, Tora.
Yep. Which, honestly, I feel like has held up very well over time. I still watch it, and I'm like, yeah, it's long, but it's got a lot of
good,
there's a lot of really good stuff in there. Yeah. Unfortunately, the very end scene, or the N-1 scene, is responsible for having introduced this myth into the common mindset, and it is simply this. So let's roll through these slides. So at the end of the attack, our hero Fuchida, who is the airborne attack leader for this entire operation, he lands on the deck of Akagi. So here he is, getting out of his Kate. Next slide, and gets down on the flight deck. He talks to his crew chief, and he's like, why hasn't the next wave taken off? And the crew chief responds, well, we weren't given any orders to that effect. And so then you have the shot of Fuchida looking up to the bridge of Akagi, and looking down from the bridge, you've got his buddy Minoru Genda, who is the first air fleet staff officer for Nagumo. He's Nagumo's right-hand man when it comes to planning any sort of air operations. Genda is seen as sort of the house genius, if you will. So they have this sort of, nonverbal communication, and then Genda goes and has this argument on the bridge with Admiral Nagumo, who you see on the right here, the task force leader. And Genda's like, no, we can't turn back now. We've got to go hit their carriers again, hit those workshops, blah, 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 to which Nagumo responds rather rudely, "Chigao," which is, "You're wrong." And basically says, this war is just beginning. We've accomplished our mission, and we're going home. And preserving this carrier task force, too, is incredibly important. So at that point, the flags go up on Akagi, and down on the flight deck, you've got Fuchida in a rage, unbelievable. How could this be, et cetera, et cetera. And that is pretty much the end of that scene. The last one, of course, is going to be the infamous, I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant, which was
Yes.
brilliant screenwriter. Yamamoto never said that. Anyway.
It is a movie sort of that presents very much sort of the image that everybody has of the attack of Pearl Harbor,
Yes.
isn't it? I mean,
yes.
you've as a researcher who's been doing this his whole life, like how many times do you run into this movie when you give talks or when you talk about the Pacific War, even with friends?
It's endless. Yeah, you run into it all the time. And, just from what do I want to say? Having been sort of pushing back against this myth for more than a decade, but you just look at the sort of the lopsided imbalance of the number of views, if you will, right? How many million people have seen Tora, Tora, Tora versus how many tens of thousands of people maybe have read journal articles by some cat named John Parshall, right? So it's a completely lopsided contest, which is why, I kind of think that the myth will never die.
Hopefully this video helps a bit.
A little bit.
Yeah, but it has everything to do then with, of course, the person that we saw on the flight deck in Tora, Fuchida. So Tell us a little bit about Fuchida, perhaps.
So Fuchida is a guy who I've spent a lot of time with over the past years, as you can imagine. I would have loved to have had a beer with him, and I've said that on numerous occasions. He was a very intelligent fellow, very charismatic, a real leader of men. And that's the reason that he is selected. He's handpicked by Genda to come in and take over the air group on Akagi, and not only be the air group commander, but eventually one of the sort of reforms that Genda is trying to ram down the throats of these carrier skippers as they're working up towards Pearl Harbor is that we need to do away with this whole notion that the carrier air groups are these separate entities that are going to be commanded either by the captain of the carrier or the individual squadron commander who's up in the air. That if we're really going to carry off an operation this sophisticated, we got to have one guy in charge of the whole shooting match when they're over Oahu. And I want that guy to be Fuchida. So Fuchida, is a very important guy. He's going to be the air group commander on Akagi for Pearl Harbor, for all the Indian Ocean raids, all the early war carrier ops. He's going to be there, obviously, at the Battle of Midway. And then after the war, he ends up publishing a book on the Battle of Midway called Midway, the Battle That Doomed Japan. And, the rest is history. But he also writes extensively about Pearl Harbor as well. And some of the early war operations. From an historiographical standpoint, his accounts are incredibly important because they are some of the few Japanese accounts that have been translated into English. And so they laid sort of the substrate, if you will, for the historiography, not only of Pearl Harbor, but also Midway. Unfortunately, he lies about a lot of stuff. So.
I mean, that reminds me a little bit of how it is for me as a researcher, mainly looking at the European theater of operations and the Luftwaffe, because you also have characters like this, like Adolf Galland, Albert Speer, who keep coming back, and their pervasiveness in the literature really comes down to the fact that they were they were there, so obviously that gives them sort of automatic credence to their words. And as historians, we have to fact check what they say, but because also they are the first ones to publish things in English and go on speaking presentations in English, they get the first foot in the door, and then everybody draws on them, and then that's how some of these myths just develop and spiral into exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, I worked in business for years and years. We call it a first mover advantage, right?
Yeah.
And Fuchida gets his stuff out into English very early in the game. Like the Midway book came out in 51 or 52. So in essence, he's sort of daring people to call BS on him, if you will. And he doesn't end up passing until 1976, by which point, with Tora, Tora, Tora having come out a few years before that, the myth at this point is kind of cemented. Not only that, but just the sheer difficulty of dealing with the Japanese primary sources from a language level standpoint meant that I would argue that there's far less material that's been translated into Japanese now than comparable records, say in German or what have you. It's just a much harder language to deal with. But you can fact check then Fuchida with regards to Pearl Harbor by actually going back and looking at some of the other interviews that he gave at the time. So if you look at his October 1945 interview to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, this is where I think it all starts. We're the ones that actually put the colonel in his head, because one of the questions that we asked him in 1945 is basically, why didn't you guys go back and hit us a third time? And Fuchida's answer in 1945 is, well, we had completed the mission objectives, which were to sink a minimum of 4 battleships. That's, kind of the task orders that we were given. And we didn't know where your carriers were, and we were a little uptight about that. And so given both of those things together, we decided, good enough, and we went home. But I think that conversation actually, sort of put the seed in Fuchida's head that, the Americans think that the fact that we didn't clobber them again was a really poor move. I wonder why. He's a very smart guy. Again, he was very good at understanding his audience. And so now if you fast forward to 1963, when he's giving interviews to Gordon Prang in preparation for Prang to put out At Dawn We Slept, the story he weaves now is that, when I was flying back from Pearl after the operation, I was mentally cataloging the dockyards and fuel tanks and logistic facilities in order to, task their destruction on the next go around. And the thing is that this flies in. It's just completely wrong with the targeting orders that they've been given. And for that, I'll pick up this copy of H.P. Willmott's book, Pearl Harbor. And one of the advantages that Willmott has is that his co-author is Haruo Tohmatsu, who is, one of the foremost naval historians in Japan. And so one of the things they have in here is the actual targeting orders, specifically Annex 3 of Operation Order Number 1, which was issued on 1 November. Targets for attack are airfields, aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers and other warships, then merchant shipping, port facilities, and finally land installations in that order. In other words, Fuchida is asking us to believe that after this attack, he had this mental epiphany where he is going to jump to the bottom of the target list, right? And that somehow that's going to change the trajectory of this war. And to do that would have been nothing less than, a renunciation of 20 years of naval training and indoctrination on his part. It just doesn't make any sense at all. Because if you look at those targeting orders there, you can see that the Japanese were barely into item number 3. The harbor was still full of cruisers and destroyers and submarines to go after. And now you're telling me I want to go all the way down to item number 6? Hello.
If Fuchida had sort of, let's say he had this moment on the flight deck as described in Tora, and he doesn't say that during the interview in 1945, unlikely, but let's go with that. There would have been people, Japanese people, his colleagues, that would probably remember him throwing, I don't want to call it a tantrum, but being very sort of passionate about going for the oil targets. Is there any evidence of this?
I'm glad you asked that, because as a matter of fact, in the very same book, we have here a set of interviews with Genda. According to Dr. Prang's book, Tora, and others, a fierce argument took place on the bridge of the Akagi after recovering of second wave aircraft as regards the proposal for a second strike, i.e. the third wave. This is not true. The author, Genda, had been on the bridge for some 8 hours before the start of operations and remained there over the following 4 days. Such a proposal was never made. I, of course, did not make such a proposal myself. The day before the attack, i.e. 6 December, I suggested to Nagumo that a second strike would be necessary should the first strike fall short. This is all that I did. But Nagumo seemed to have no plan to implement a second strike. Later on, Kusaka told me that even before the start of the operation, he and Nagumo had decided not to carry out a second strike. So there's Genda explicitly calling BS on that entire sequence on the bridge that we see in Tora. It never took place.
And just to confirm for the audience, because we speak of first wave and second wave, but that is part of the first strike, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, the whole operation was conceived of as 2 attack waves, but yes, a third strike or a third wave would have happened after that, sometime in the afternoon. And there's all sorts of other technical problems that go into that too. I mean, you got a whole bunch of damaged aircraft back in this task force. You would have had to, assess how many of these aircraft are actually going to be in a position to be repaired and, usable in a second attack wave. Is it going to be a mixed strike with Vals and Cates? How are we going to go about doing this? The other thing that Willmott actually raises is that the destroyers were getting pretty low on fuel. They've done this 24-knot charge down from the north to get within position, and the sea conditions were rough as hell. So, as a naval commander, you're always kind of wary about what's the status of my fuel on my destroyers, because if I get into a naval battle, those are the guys that are always in the greatest risk of going empty on me. So in any case, by the time they would have been able to put this whole thing together and launch a strike, they might have been in a position where they would have been looking at doing a nighttime recovery as well. That's not a good deal. So all in all, it just doesn't seem like the conditions were very propitious, even if they had wanted to go ahead and do that. And the fact that Genda explicitly says that there were no plans in the hopper to make that happen, I think just sort of puts paid to the whole Fuchida myth.
Yeah. And Fuchida, he was overseeing also the second wave, is that correct?
Yeah, he remains orbiting over the harbor while the second wave comes in and does their thing. And in all honesty, the second wave, which is composed entirely of dive bombers, was botched. That group of planes, and this is made very clear if you read Alan Zimm's book on Pearl Harbor. My man Justin has it right here. Yeah, buddy. Alan is a former naval planner himself, and he makes the argument that the tasking for those weapons was just absolutely inappropriate. You've got dive bombers that have 250 kilogram bombs that are not going to make it through the deck armor of a battleship. And yet the Nevada, which was underway at this time and trying to exit the harbor mouth, just draws these dive bombers like a magnet. And yes, eventually Nevada ends up beaching herself. But that was more a result of the torpedo damage that she had absorbed earlier. And in the process of that, there were 4 big cruisers over by the repair basin that are all going to go on to have very active careers later in 1942 down in Guadalcanal, which were, just chock-a-block right next to each other. Perfect target for dive bombers, could have been absolutely smoked by those guys. And instead, none of them received so much as a bomb. So, if you're doing a dispassionate evaluation of Fuchida's effectiveness as a flight leader, you have to say that the first wave was, that was all aces, but the second wave was botched, and there's this whole business of the flares being misfired and blah, 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 blah. So there were some things about Fuchida's performance that I'm sure he was eager to sort of cover up as well. But yeah, as you see here on this next slide, basic assessment of the attack is that it is absolutely revolutionary. I would argue that Kido-Butai for its time was as revolutionary at sea as German Panzer Division was on land. That you had got this organization that could do things in terms of strategic air power projection that had never been done before. So, yeah, a really sophisticated attack, tactically, okay, kind of mixed grades. They left money on the table, if you will, in form of some of those cruisers and other targets that could have been hit by that second wave. So tactically, mostly successful. They did not sink any American carriers, obviously. They did achieve this sort of 6-month window that that the Japanese required, because we haven't talked about sort of the larger context for the Pearl Harbor attack. We as Americans over-focus on Pearl Harbor. It's like that was the only thing that was happening on December 7th. It's like, no, there's this huge, incredibly complex set of operations happening in the Western Pacific where the Japanese are invading Malaya. They are attacking Hong Kong. They're getting ready to unwind operations into the Philippines. And there's a lot of moving pieces here. What the Pearl Harbor attack was designed to do was to secure the eastward flank of that advance to the south, because the whole objective of this first phase campaign is to capture Sumatra and Java and Borneo, because that's where all the oil is, right? So Pearl Harbor is not only an operation that is designed to affect American morale, but it is also to secure that eastern flank to ensure that the Japanese can do their dirty business down south and not face any interruptions from the American Navy. And it was very successful in that regard. But yeah, that brings us then to this third bullet. It is an attempt to go after American morale by sinking American capital ships, but the result is absolutely 180 degrees from that. That in fact the Americans are just incredibly righteously pissed off. And, there are now lines forming out the recruiting stations that go on all night long in New York City. So instead of being a strategic benefit for the Japanese, it actually turns out to be a grand strategic disaster for them.
I think this is also a bit related to Fuchida, but it's something else that I often see popping up online, is that instead of sort of this westward advance that they did in the Southeast Asia, why not use the Kido Butai to take Hawaii?
Great question. That's a great question. And that is one of the most, there's two sort of classic counterfactuals, and that's one of them. The bottom line is that if you look at sort of the shipping assets that the Japanese have available to them at the beginning of the war, it's a very fixed pool. They can only lift about 2 divisions at a time, which means that if you posit that the most important operation is capturing Java and Borneo and Sumatra for the oil, I've got to get the Malayan operation underway as quickly as possible, because Singapore is the linchpin of all of the British defensive operations in that neck of the woods. And I've got to get that campaign underway so I can capture Singapore, so I can put paid to any notion of the Royal Navy intervening in this larger campaign. So just from a divisional lift standpoint, the Japanese don't have enough assets to actually put together a multi-divisional invasion force that would go in against Oahu. And the other thing I would point out is that, it's one thing to come in with this carrier task force that can charge down from the north at 24 knots, get within air range, punish the island, hit and run and get out of there. It's quite another to take a 6 or 8 knot invasion force and run that into the maw of Oahu's threat environment, and then show up on the beaches and hopefully carry off a successful amphibious invasion. The Americans got a lot of troops on this island. They got at least 1 or 2 divisions, and 1 for sure. Yes, we're not very prepared for an invasion. Yes, I have my doubts as to whether or not we were tactically ready to go toe-to-toe with the Japanese on the ground. But when you think about the objections that Imperial General Headquarters back in Tokyo raises to this operational scheme just in the first place, that they thought they were going to lose at least half of their carriers. And the only reason Yamamoto is able to get this operation okayed is by threatening to resign. He uses blackmail, in essence, to ram this operational concept down the throats of the guys back in Tokyo. There's no way in hell that Tokyo was going to accede to his, even if he had wanted to like, okay, we're gonna bet the ranch entirely. We're gonna load 2 divisions of guys onto these transports and take them all the way to Oahu. That is just shockingly dangerous, I guess I would say. So I don't know that they could have done it. And certainly by the time, if you fast forward 6 months to the time of the Battle of Midway, I know for sure they couldn't have done it. there were, more than 100,000 service personnel on Oahu at that point in time. So that ain't happening.
So why was oil then so low down the list? I mean,
Great
looking at the
question.
war, it's when we talk about European theater of operations, again, it's all about hitting the oil fields. And taking away the Germans' ability to fuel their tanks and fuel their aircraft. The Americans, maybe that's also what influenced that strategic bombing survey, that question that they posed to Fuchida, right?
Absolutely.
Why are the Japanese not going after the oil?
I think if you look at the whole scheme of Japan's war, they are fighting what I would call a deliberately short-sighted war, in that they know they've got to get this puppy over with in 6 months to a year. That's the window of opportunity, right? And from the American standpoint, we're the world's largest oil producer with a bullet by that point in time. I think we produce something on the order of between half and 2/3 of the entire world's crude. We are Saudi Arabia in this war, is what it comes down to. So if you look at Pearl Harbor through the lens of a play against American morale, the conventional coin of the realm was, hey, we're going to blow up their battleships and that's going to demoralize them, and the Americans then will sue for peace. If you blow up a bunch of oil tanks, does that make any impression on American morale whatsoever? I would argue no, because we're going to be like, yeah, I've got Texas. I can replace that. So I just don't think it's an effective mechanism from a morale standpoint. And two, probably more importantly, if you look at Japanese naval doctrine as a whole, it is ultra Mahanian in outlook. Namely, everything we as a Navy should be doing is focused on destroying enemy warships. That's our job. And that if we destroy enemy warships and win decisive fleet engagements, sea control will automatically devolve to us. And if you're living in that mindset, things like logistics just go way down the list in terms of priorities. You see the same thing happening with respect to how they try to not protect their own shipping lanes, right? Anti-submarine warfare, that is way down the totem pole. So, it just doesn't feature very prominently in their Navy, which is another reason why I would argue that for Fuchida to have allegedly made this mental epiphany and go down to, shore installations and that kind of thing, that's completely antithetical to everything he's been fed as a naval officer throughout his entire career.
I guess I can interject here as well, because we're on the topic of oil tanks. So I'll let the spirit of Alan Zimm possess me for a moment as well, because I really like this part of his book where he's getting into these targets as targets. And he gets into a lot of detail. We won't tumble down all the way down that rabbit hole. You'll have to just read the book for that, for anyone interested. But basically, the oil tanks themselves are harder targets than kind of was implied for many, many decades. Where it's like, oh yeah, you just send a couple zeros over there and strafe them and they'll blow up. It's like, well, they've got fire suppression systems, they have floating tops, the sides of the tanks are actually quite thick, so on the aircraft armament side of things, like, they're not going to penetrate. Zimm does some theory crafting with that. I can actually back it up as well with another work by Richard Dunn, who actually has examples of Zeros strafing fuel tanks in China.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't know about that.
And in fact, in the context of that book, he's using it to discuss the power of the 20mm cannon, because they left very considerable dents in the side of the tanks, but they didn't penetrate the tanks because they're contact fuse high explosive.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just, there's a mismatch there. They can't do it, which means they need bombs. So then you start to become, as Zimm gets into gratuitous detail, you've got a certain number of 250 kilogram bombs, and where are you putting them? And then between, 500 acres of port facilities, which we'll get into, I'm sure, and then plus the fuel tanks, plus shipping targets. Eventually it's like you're going to have to pick and choose. I think from his numbers, he's like, let's say optimistically 60% of tanks destroyed, and then it opens up discussions of does that even destroy enough fuel oil capacity to cause a bottleneck. And it's not as simple a question as I think a lot of the implication for many decades has kind of led on.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I was actually going to ask you too, in the same context. I mean, when we look at Japanese naval aviation operations in China, do we see any preference for attacking what I would call logistical targets rather than terror targets? It seems like is the main focus of their air campaign. So are there any analogs that we can take out of China that pertain to Pearl Harbor in that respect?
Yeah, like not so much, and I guess it's because it's hard to find targets of value deep in China of that nature. So of course they have some production capacity and things like that. I guess maybe the closest you could come to would be the interdiction campaign that they kind of fought off and on in southern China, where they were trying to cut off, hit railroads and things to cut off supplies coming in, and that. The success they had there was pretty limited for a variety of reasons. But yeah, there isn't that kind of, we're going to specifically target fuel tanks. Like as far as the Japanese Navy Air Service was concerned, it was a heavy fixation on, what we would call offensive counter air in combination with effectively terror bombing. And we're not using that term lightly. It is very accurate to call it terror bombing because the stated intent from 1938 was we're seeing that the ground war is grinding into a relative stalemate. We're not going to be able to just win on the ground. So we will literally bomb, I think they called them political and strategic targets, cities effectively, and try to get the Chinese to give up. And that is what they spend a lot of their energy on.
Yeah. I think we also see the same then as we go into Malaya and Burma in 41, where the Japanese army focuses mainly on control of the air, hitting some airfields, but really it's just the army overrunning the airfields after the British and the Commonwealth forces, basically pull out of them. There is a little bit of bombing, perhaps you can, in the margins around Singapore, where you can say, well, they hit some sort of facilities. But I don't think I've really looked or seen, rather, anything that would suggest that the Japanese had a specific focus, neither the Navy or the Army Air Service, on logistics, even throughout the war. I'm sure that we can find one or two examples if we look closely enough. But now, from all the work that Justin and I have done, I don't think even in past videos we ever touched upon this, have we?
Yeah. Did they hit them in Darwin, if I remember right?
And that was just what I was going to raise. Darwin and Colombo. During those two attacks, I'm not aware right off the top of my head, did they go after logistical targets in either of those two attacks? And now my Australian friends like Peter Dunn are going to be like, "What? You don't know this?" So, yeah, I'm a failure in that respect. But I do think that the larger point remains consistent in that the Japanese Navy as a whole was very much not fixated on logistics. And, another classic example of that, of course, is the aftermath of the Battle of Savo Island at the very beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign. I think you can make a pretty credible argument that Admiral Mikawa, having destroyed the Allied cruiser force that was there, he debates, whether or not he should turn around and go back to the transport anchorage. And he's scared of the fact that he doesn't know where Fletcher's carriers are. He's unaware of the fact that Fletcher's carriers have actually unpropitiously just decided to withdraw a few hours previous to that. But I think the larger issue there, again, is that Mikawa feels that he's won this great victory at sea and that therefore sea control should devolve naturally to us. We're going to be able to bring down whatever units of the Imperial Army we're going to need to expel these pesky marine invaders. And the result is that he doesn't go back to the transport anchorage. And in retrospect, I think it's pretty clear that it would have been worth the loss potentially of the majority, if not all, of Mikawa's force to destroy those transports then and there and just cut the logistical knees off for that entire operation. I think it would have paid to it. So anyway, all of that, I think, is pertinent to why we don't see a lot of fire in the belly from guys like Nagumo and his chief of staff Kusaka as to know we got to go back and hit Pearl Harbor and cream their logistics facilities. It's not on the radar screen.
Is there, I mean, if we look at, for example, Japanese submarine captains, are there any sort of standing orders for them to hunt specifically transport over Navy ships, or?
No, quite the opposite.
Okay.
In fact, you can, I should, there is nuance here in that there was an initial Japanese sort of surge where they put submarines off of Oahu and also off the U.S. West Coast. And they do sink some transports, particularly off of Oahu, and that freaks a lot of people out. The fact that there were Japanese transport or submarines operating off of California in particular, just, because in the early part of the war, of course, with the immense successes that the Japanese experienced on the ground, they looked 10 feet tall. And so there were a lot of people on the West Coast that were kind of panicking that, there could be an invasion here, which is utterly ludicrous from a logistical standpoint. But, nevertheless. Anyway, back to the submarine tasking. No, they are primarily doctrinally focused on destroying warships. And they're pretty damn successful at that, actually, in the early parts of the Guadalcanal campaign. They sink the carrier Wasp. They torpedo the Saratoga. They put torps into North Carolina as well, which is going to send her back to the shop. So, there's this time period in August through October where Japanese submarines were doing much better than our submarines, and they had sunk some capital ships, so they were legit.
I mean, what was the bottleneck then early on for the U.S. Navy? Was it that they had to always return to Hawaii? Where else did they have sort of refueling capacity, or were they completely reliant on oil tankers at the early stage of the war?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. And there's a guy named Sal Mercogliano who runs a channel called What's Up with Shipping. I actually just did a talk with him a few weeks ago talking about just shipping in 1942 in general, because I talk about that a lot in my 42 book. And he's a real expert on the first 6 fast oilers that were in the Pacific, including Neosho and some of her sisters. That was the bottleneck right there, was fast oilers. We just didn't have enough of them. And, the fact that Neosho got sunk at the end of Coral Sea, or really in the middle of Coral Sea, that pretty much puts paid to that operation. We have in our minds that these carriers are out there operating, but they're always invisibly tethered to the oilers that have to be operating just a few hundred miles back behind them, because the distances in the Pacific are just so enormous. It's 3,000 miles to get down to the Coral Sea. It's just crazy far away. So yes, that meant that the fast oilers were very, very important and needed to be protected extensively. And it also meant that Oahu had to be guarded within an inch of its life after the initial attack, because you're right, it is the logistical hub around which everything revolves for at least the first 6 months of that war. The other thing that's happening, though, in the interim is we've got this supply line that runs down to Australia, that goes through places like Fiji and Tonga, New Caledonia, and we're sprinkling little garrisons down along that supply line. We're plunking, regimental combat teams here and there, which really kind of aggravated Marshall and the U.S. Army, because, Europe first was supposed to be the way we're going here. And yet, if you look at the flow of Army personnel into various theaters, we're putting more men in the Pacific from the get-go than we are in, shipping them across to the Brits. But what's happening there is we're sort of armoring this supply line. And we're not only creating garrisons, we're also creating fueling points. Because among other things, Australia is so far away that we don't want to be shipping lots of oil to it. We would rather be refueling our ships at places like, New Caledonia, so they can make the final run down to Australia and then come back and get re-oiled back out there, rather than having to push oil all the way down to that neck of the woods. The result of that is going to be, though, that when we win the Battle of Midway and King decides to, seize the initiative in the Pacific, now we've got some of these bases scattered along here that have barely enough in the way of logistical facilities that they can serve as jumping off points for a counteroffensive. And that's the reason that we're able to initiate Operation Watchtower within just 2 months of having won at Midway.
I don't want to go too much into counterfactuals because we already have a lot of myths with Fuchida in this video alone. But were there any oil tankers at Pearl Harbor that could have been hit?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, the Neosho in the room. Yeah,
Neosho. Neosho is tied up at the dock. She's between California and the lead pair. That's West Virginia and I think Tennessee. I don't have my map handy here, but she is right in the middle of this, and she doesn't get a scratch. But and she would have burned like a torch if she had been hit by so much as, somebody flicked their bick. And in the interim between the first wave and the attack wave, her skipper, gets her up to speed and backs her out of there. And I don't know where he ends up putting that ship, but he's like, I'm getting out of here. Among other things, because there's a lot of burning fuel oil from the battleships at this point too. So Neosho is in danger of, being engulfed in this conflagration from the other ships. So that was a near run thing right there. And that too, that tells you something about Japanese targeting priorities, that if those had been important, Fuchida, my man, why didn't you slate slate a Chutai of these dive bombers that are coming in from the second wave and put paid to that sucker? Go knock out that oiler. She's a huge target. Hit her, but no such thing.
Yeah, and I guess I can add there is they don't even necessarily have the excuse that they're not thinking about oilers, because I was just in preparation for this, I was rereading an article in the Journal of Military History from, I'm going to butcher this, David Fuquea?
Yeah.
On Japanese and their own fleet of fast oilers and how much attention they were paying to fast oilers and how they were so important.
Yeah.
And it's like there was they didn't connect that line.
Yeah.
I guess like at that point. And
And Dave's article is really important because I wish that he had published that before I had written Shattered Sword, because I learned stuff there. I did not know that their unrep capabilities were as sophisticated as they were. That was a real eye-opener.
Oh yeah, it blew my mind.
Yeah, for sure. So, but great point. I've never thought of that before. But as part of the workup to Pearl Harbor, not only do they have to figure out all of their air group evolutions and how do we take this force of 6 carriers and just wield them in such a way that we can create these enormous conglomerate air groups. We've also got to figure out how to get the damn carriers over there. It's 3,500 nautical miles. And so, what Fuquea, I don't know. Dave, what his article points out is that they were putting a lot of emphasis in figuring out how to do their underway refueling, and it was very, very effective.
Do you see any sort of learning that towards the end of the war that there's a shift? I mean, I've looked into the targeting of kamikaze planes, for example. Now, a lot of them never got even close to where they could have done any serious damage, and I think the most targeted ship were just Pickett DDs, right?
Yep.
But is there anything there that they say, like, go for the transports?
Well, they do that at the very end of the war. If you look at the planning for Operation Tenichigo, which is going to be the final climactic attempt on the part of not Tenichigo, Ketsugo, to repel the American invasion that they know is coming. Yeah, they switched their targeting. They're like, we know we're not going to be able to get to the American carrier task forces. That ain't happening. But attack transports, those are big, juicy, slow targets that are very weakly defended. And we're going to be operating in a threat environment where instead of having to fly over several hundred miles worth of open water, in radar range of these Americans, man, I can wheel my Zero out of a cave next to a road, launch that thing on a road, fly over land for the majority of my ingress, and then only the very last minute, when I'm close to the invasion beaches, I can see those transports out there, 5 miles away. Now, from just an engagement window standpoint, the Americans have a terrible problem in that regard. You've got this stationary target that maybe has got a 5-inch gun on it, but it hasn't got a Mark 37 director, I'm here to tell you. So how do you defend a ship like that against a platform like a kamikaze, which is a much more accurate weapons delivery system than a dive bomber with a dumb bomb? So yeah, they did learn, at least at the very end of the war. Thank God we never had an opportunity to see how effective or ineffective that might have been.
Yeah, if anyone in the audience wants Nightmare Fuel, Hell to Pay by Jen Greco.
Yeah.
Man, that's a grim read.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, on both sides, because of course, if we were having trouble coming ashore, well, I guess we'll use atomic weapons against the beach and clear it, and then we'll follow it up with mustard gas just to make sure. I mean, all of those options were very much on the table. But, to your original question, do we ever see sort of a heightened awareness within the Imperial Navy as to the importance of logistics throughout the war? I would argue no, not until the very, very end.
And what's the Japanese assessment then of Pearl Harbor? I mean, if we look initially at it, and also over the course of the war. Now, you said that, of course, he never said "Awaken the Giant."
Yeah.
But is there sort of a reassessment of that operation, of where they're saying, like, actually it didn't go as good or as bad as we thought it did?
That's a really good question. I don't know from a sort of a contemporaneous standpoint what the Japanese thought about it later in the war. Certainly in the near term, they very much thought that it did what it was supposed to do from an operational standpoint, namely secure that eastern flank. And it did allow them to do this enormously successful advance to the south and grab all the goodies that they needed to go to war for. So, yay team. I think if you were to ask them, after the war, how did things go? I think that the more perceptive among their observers, cats like Genda, would have said, yeah, that didn't turn out well, just purely from a morale standpoint, in that an infuriated America was the very last thing that we needed, because they knew that they had to come up to some sort of a negotiated settlement in the short term. How do you do that if the Americans, I mean, you look at FDR's speech on 8 December, and he foreshadows this whole notion of unconditional surrender. No matter how long it may take us, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Those are his words. And he doesn't define what absolute victory is, but it's pretty clear that it's like, no, we're dictating the terms, suckers. You started it. We're going to end it. So right there, FDR is essentially kicked over the negotiating table. There's not going to be a negotiated peace, So, yeah, early post-war observers, they would know that.
Considering that end that you now talked about, I sort of want to loop it back to Fuchida, because what I saw on combinedfleet.com is you have identified multiple instances where Fuchida has been a bit loose with his interpretations, and he seems to have said that he was on that ship on the Missouri when the documents were signed.
This is laughable. The bottom line is, Fuchida is the kind of guy who is not going to let some pesky little facts stand in the way of telling a great war story. Particularly not if he's going to be sitting at a bar with somebody. And again, he was very, very good at understanding his audience and playing to his audience. That's one of the reasons, frankly, he was a successful preacher, is that he is charismatic. He's very smart, and he's able to kind of get into people's heads and understand what they want to hear. There are a number of things that he talks about during the war that are just absolute malarkey and can be disproven by the Japanese operational records. And the final one, of course, is this notion that, yeah, I was on the battleship Missouri during the ceremony. He spins this story that I was in charge of logistics. I had this big launch. I was going to bring the surrender party out to the Missouri, blah, blah, blah. And then the Americans weren't going to allow anybody to be doing that except us. So we sent a destroyer. We picked up the delegation. We brought them over, put them in launches. We did all that because it gives us control. And understand that at the end of this war, we are incredibly concerned about any sort of acts of Japanese treachery. That's one of the reasons that Raymond Spruance is not on board the Missouri that morning. He is in Okinawa because we understand that if there's some sort of last-minute snafu and the Japanese pull a dirty trick and kill all our senior officers on the Missouri, we need a capable fleet commander who is capable of running this war. And we know that Spruance is basically an unemotional refrigerator, and he's not going to care. So he's the guy who doesn't get to be on the deck of the Missouri. So the notion that Fuchida just rolls up to Missouri, the flagship of this fleet, with Halsey and Nimitz and MacArthur standing on it, hey man, here I am in my launch. Can I come see what's going on here? No way in hell that is going to happen. Yeah. Certainly he's not going to be ushered up into the superstructure of this ship and given a spot. All of these spots were very clearly taken. And if you're an American sailor, are you going to give up your spot for this ceremony to some anonymous Japanese dude who shows up in a boat that might be full of explosives too? It's ludicrous. He was never there.
Well, it's interesting, and I guess we started our whole conversation with this sort of the long shadow that some characters have in the historiography, and how that is quite damaging, and how it's really the duty of the historian of, okay, fair enough, accepting that person was there and that person may have said some things that were correct, but really fact checking the beats to the granular detail and going from there and reevaluating some of that historiography that has already been published in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
And you must find yourself in exactly the same position. I mean, particularly in air combat, it's always, he said versus she said, right? And I got to the point where I can see Fuchida's book up on my shelf. Every statement that he would make that seemed, I highlight it, and it's like, do I have another corroborating source? And if I don't, I'm going to be very, very wary about using that. It's tough.
Absolutely. I mean, Justin and I, when we talk about the PTO, and Justin, you have this more than me, really, because you're the expert between us two on this theater.
Between us three.
Yeah, Justin, we need a book from you, please.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'll do your maps for you, Justin.
Oh, that'd be great.
See?
Maps give me nightmares.
IJA. That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
There we go. Book is half written already. You just got to cram all that knowledge into a couple of pages and you're done. Yeah. We do see this quite a lot of times with, and it speaks exactly to what you were saying, the language problem. And it's only starting. There have been some historians that have, of course, brought stuff from Japanese sources, but it's really just happening. I don't want to say now, but it's built on that early transmission of knowledge, and now it's accelerating. And it's quite an interesting time now to read about.
I think those barriers are going to fall very, very rapidly. There's a lot of work going on, frankly, using AI to go after some of these sources. I know because I'm involved in a project that's looking at some of that stuff. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to translate things like Senshi Sosho, which are really difficult and obtuse and written in this sort of archaic academic form of Japanese that a lot of modern Japanese can't even read. But, AI doesn't care about that kind of stuff. And it's not all the way there yet, but I do think that a lot of these language barriers are going to fall. Even now. So one of my side gigs, I lead tours for the National World War II Museum down in New Orleans. And so I'm like Mr. Pacific. I go out there 2-3 times a year. And one of the tours that we do is through Japan. And we go to a number of museums in the course of that. And it's amazing now, if you've got Google Translate on your phone, you just point it at some of these exhibits and the placards. It's like a magic wand. I wish I had it when, I was living there with my wife in 91, right after we got married, because trying to read this stuff, are you really going to drag a kanji dictionary into these museums? It's tough to do, but I do think that those language barriers are going to fall here in the very near future.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually talking about sort of future research, so you have your new book coming up, and that's going to be published next year in 2026. Talk a little bit about that. What are you researching there?
So for the last 16 years, I have been working on this book. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do after Shattered Sword. I was really interested in the year 1942 as a whole, and I felt ignorant. And I just wanted to educate myself on the larger structure of that year and to do the entire war. So this is not just the Pacific. It's Pacific, Eastern Front, Mediterranean, strategic bombing in Europe, the whole smack. And so it's been a very big project. And the manuscript actually just got thrown over the wall to Oxford 2 weeks ago. So my editor is working on it now, which feels incredibly good, but also incredibly weird. Because every day for 16 years, I've, gotten up and polished this thing a little bit more. And granted, my day job was in technology up until 4 years ago. And so I was, I had a paying job and I was doing this kind of as my hobby at night. But nevertheless, it's been a very long project and a very big project. The book is going to be over 1,000 pages. Yeah, it's going to be a doorstop.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a honker. But I think it's very readable, and it's got, hundreds of maps in it, about 140 maps, a lot of timelines, a lot of photos. And it is definitely meant to be, my writing style is frankly how I speak. I'm very conversational in nature. I want this book to be able to be readable by my cousin or anybody who's an educated layperson and just has an interest in World War II. I'm not a specialist. I'm a popular historian, I guess I would say. That's who I like to write for. So yeah, should be out in about a year.
Fantastic. Well, we'll have a link in the description where people can sign up on the official mailing list. And then I assume you're sending out newsletters every now and then?
Yeah, I just did my first update. I was kind of waiting for contractual details to be ironed out, but the fact that we now have marching orders, I guess the other sort of weird thing about the book is that I'm actually the guy that's going to lay out and design the whole thing, just like I did with Shattered Sword. So everything between the covers, that's me, which gives me an enormous amount of control over where do I want those maps to be? What's the caption for that photo going to be? Because that's the bane of all authors, is that some other editor writes the caption for you and it's just, oh God, I can't believe you said that. That's wrong.
That's the wrong plane.
That's the wrong plane. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You see that all the time, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll be getting into that process later on this year. And it should be out late spring 2026.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to that. And if anybody in the audience has sort of questions regarding what we talked about, do post them below. And then Jonathan will keep up the conversation in the future as well.
Appreciate it.
Maybe incorporate some of those questions there as well. Thank you very much for taking your time for this. And it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Get ad-free early access to videos just like this one by supporting the channel over Patreon or via channel memberships. As always, have a great day and see you in the sky.